Last November was the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. A lot has been said about the revolution, if it had any positive impact at all. To answer this question, we have to look at the common story told about this revolution. At the turn of the 20th century, Tsarist Russia was largely an agrarian society, dominated by the iron grip of the Tsar and Russian nobility. Industries sprung up in the cities, where workers toiled under poor working conditions and long hours, leading them to form unions and eventually revolutionary parties. Pressure from the Western powers and the ambition of the Tsar propelled the country into war with Germany in the First World War. This turned out to be a disaster for the Russian army, with upwards of 2 million soldiers dead. By 1916, deserters began to lead the front en masse and return to the city. Workers in the cities went on strike over lack of food caused by the war and eventually called for the downfall of the Tsar. A provisional government was shortly set up alongside the Soviets, which were at the time strike committees. The provisional government would eventually be overthrown by the Bolshevik Party in the October Revolution, handing state power directly to the Soviets. The new government became a single-party dictatorship, run by self-serving leaders, holding on to their power through terror no different from their Tsarist predecessors. However, the reality is far more complex. For one thing, the choice for Russians in 1917 was not between dictatorship and a democratic provisional government. The provisional government was highly unstable and unpopular for continuing the war against Germany. Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, ordered his troops to shoot down demonstrators against the war in June 1917. General Kornilov took advantage of this instability and attempted a coup in August 1917, which was ultimately derailed by the Bolsheviks. Kornilov was part of the White Movement among Russian generals who wanted to restore the Tsar or install a military dictatorship. The White Movement continued to fight the Soviet government after the October Revolution. They were supported with ammunition and supplies by several world powers. In fact, all the major world powers invaded the Soviet Union during the Civil War, supporting the Whites. The White armies conducted large-scale pogroms against the Jewish population and indiscriminately razed villages to the ground if they were suspected to be Bolshevik sympathizers. If the White Movement succeeded, Russia would undeniably have become a fascist dictatorship. At the end of the war, industrial output declined to 14% of what it was in 1917. The population of the working class was also reduced to half, and as many died of war or famine or simply moved to the countryside. The Bolsheviks at the time were under no illusions of building socialism on their own. Lenin hoped for the revolution to spread to Germany and the rest of the industrial world, where these revolutionary states would help Russia industrialize and lay the foundation to socialism. However, the revolutions in Europe were eventually defeated, leaving the Soviet Union to fend from themselves. In this situation, many workers were no longer involved in their local Soviets. The party was forced to employ former Tsarist bureaucrats in the Soviets and other government organs. Many of these bureaucrats eventually joined the party. The lack of skilled workers, the severe damage of the war, led to the bureaucrats running the party by diktat and hence eroding party democracy. They will eventually form a privileged caste running the Soviet state. Veteran Bolsheviks initially resisted this tendency, but were eventually expelled from the party and exiled. Despite the corruption of the party bureaucracy, the Russian Revolution made many gains for ordinary people. The Soviet Union became the first country to grant equal rights to women in both economic and political life. Equal pay for equal work was passed into law. Women in pre-revolutionary Russia were largely confined to domestic labor. After the Bolsheviks came to power, they started building communal kitchens and laundries in order to free up women's time spent at the home. Abortions were free to access, and women were allowed to keep their family names after marriage. With initial complications, the first 5-year plans of the Soviet Union were major achievements. Russia went from being one of the poorest countries in Europe to a major industrial power in the span of 3 decades, despite the devastation caused by 2 world wars and the Civil War. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union had the fastest GDP per capita growth in the world, second to Japan. The Soviets also had more doctors and engineers than Western countries. In fact, there were almost as many women engineers in the Soviet Union than engineers of both genders in the United States. Unlike in capitalist countries, the Soviet Union also had negligible unemployment, which is also confirmed in an American study. The Soviet space program was well known, sending the first man, woman, and dog into space. This was all achieved despite the bottlenecks in the Soviet economy. The bottlenecks, among other things, were caused by a self-seeking managerial class and a corrupt bureaucracy. The Russian Revolution has a rich and complex legacy that activists can learn from today. The Russian Revolution inspired the labor movement in several countries. Activists inspired by the revolution would go on to fight for better working conditions and benefits, such as pensions and healthcare. In fact, many Western countries would go on to implement social democratic reforms, such as universal healthcare, out of fear of the labor movement. The revolution would also inspire several anti-colonial struggles across the world. Social and labor movements today can learn much from the Bolshevik method of organizing and their use of slogans and programs, and adapt them to current situation, even if revolution is not on the immediate agenda.